Alright, welcome to the first day of Mr. Kniesly's Upsidedown Classroom. If you remember, this means you take your note-taking sheet and you fill in the details from the notes at home, and then we do things that would typically be homework or other activities in class. If you have any questions about these notes, we'll be going over them for about 5 to 10 minutes in the beginning of the next class. My request is that everyone try to get these done before the end of break, but we'll see what happens. So the first thing we're going to be talking about are the legislative powers of Congress. We started these notes last time, but I'm just going to start over them again. Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives, and the Senate, has two types of powers. So we've got the House, we've got the Senate, and they each have two types of powers. Those two types are express powers and implied powers. Remember as you're filling these in that you can pause at any time, write in the notes, and then play again, or rewind, or however you want to do it. But don't necessarily worry about getting everything written down at the pace I take it. I may move on faster than you would like. Express powers, which is the first one we're going to talk about of those two, are those listed directly in the United States Constitution. So, the Constitution has written out exactly what each branch of government is supposed to be. Remember, the Constitution is kind of like a how to build the United States government do-it-yourself kit. So Articles 1, 2, and 3 talk about the three branches. Article 1 is the legislative branch. And in clauses 1 through 17, which means statements 1 through 17 on that article, if you look it up, you can look for yourself, but I'm not requiring you to. It lists the specific powers of Congress, so these expressed powers, things that the Constitution specifically says Congress can do. The first of these expressed powers, and perhaps the most important, is that Congress has the power to tax and spend money. So remember, under the Articles of Confederation, one of the reasons we said the Articles of Confederation failed is that the government did not have the power to tax its citizens or spend money because it could not tax. The Constitution wants to make sure that that doesn't happen again, so it says, Congress, you can tax and spend. They also can regulate commerce. This means trade between both foreign countries and states here within the United States. So interstate commerce and international commerce. They also deal with foreign relations and treaties. So they're the ones who declare war. So later we'll talk about the executive branch and how the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So the president is in charge of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, etc. But Congress are the ones who actually declare war. So the president can't say, all right, Mexico, we're going to war. No, it's only the Congress that can say that. They also have the power of approval and removal. So when we talked about checks and balances, we discussed this a little bit. The Congress has to approve or reject presidential nominees. So, if Obama wants to appoint me to the Supreme Court, then he would tell Congress, I'm going to appoint Mr. Kniesly to the Supreme Court. Congress would then debate whether or not I should be on the Supreme Court, and then they would vote. Chances are they would vote that I would not be on the Supreme Court, and then the president, saying, I want Mr. Kniesly here, would be checked by the Congress, which says, nope, Mr. Kniesly is not going to be on the Supreme Court. Congress also impeaches officials. So let's say President Obama starts breaking the law. Like several banks downtown get robbed, and President Obama and I and a couple other people are the ones responsible. Well, that would never happen. But if it did, Congress could say, we're going to have impeachment hearings for President Obama for robbing banks. The most recent time this happened is with President Clinton, like we talked about during the checks and balances discussion, and that was where President Clinton committed both perjury and obstruction of justice. Now, perjury means you lie under oath. So if I'm being interviewed by the court, I get sworn in, and then I say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, then he didn't tell the truth. And obstruction of justice because they said he interfered with their investigation. Speaking of investigations, Congress also has the power of oversight and investigation. This means they watch everything, and then they're allowed to investigate problems. So, with Clinton, they investigated problems. With Nixon, they investigated problems. With the recent attack in Syria, no. Give me 1 second. Side note, as a teacher, it's always important to get your countries right. Benghazi is in Libya. There we go. Alright, so, yes, the consular attack in Libya, certain congresspersons have expressed that that was not handled correctly, that the people of the United States may not have been given the whole story, so they're investigating. They're the ones who can call Secretary Clinton to the Capitol to testify. They're the ones who could call former head of the CIA, David Petraeus, to testify, things like that. Next, we have implied powers. And as I said at the beginning, implied powers are things that are... Actually, I didn't say that. Implied powers are things that are not listed in the Constitution. So, Clause 18 of Article 1, so right there at the end of Article 1, it says that Congress has the power to, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry out its duties. So, necessary and proper. Well, if something needs done and a thing that to accomplish that goal is necessary, so one, there's actually a problem, and proper, meaning that it's not ridiculous, then Congress can use those powers even if the Constitution doesn't quite list them. And this has been kind of a gray area, because remember we talked about consent of the governed, we talk about limited government, where government can't do something without the approval of the people, and government gets its power from the people. Well, this kind of says, yes, government gets its power from the people, but they're allowed to interpret that power if they deem it necessary and proper. And that's why Congress can pass laws that then get considered unconstitutional. So it gets a little confusing, but implied powers mean powers that aren't listed in the Constitution that Congress determines are necessary. Clause 18, the one we were just talking about, has a couple of nicknames. One is the elastic clause. The other is the necessary and proper clause. So elastic meaning that Congress can stretch their powers to meet their new needs. Necessary and proper are the words directly from that. A loose interpretation would mean that we basically say Congress can make any law that we don't say they can't. A strict interpretation means that Congress can only make laws that are mentioned in the Constitution. So about things mentioned in the Constitution. And again, this is a gray area. This is a really tricky debate throughout American history. Now that we talked about the actual duties of Congress, the powers of Congress, let's talk about the influences on the lawmaking process. So similar to influences on elections, which we talked about before, influences on the lawmaking process are very similar. So elected officials write the laws and take action in response to problems or issues. This is called public policy. The Constitution influences the lawmaking process because the formal powers of Congress are limited by the Constitution of the United States. So the biggest influence on the lawmaking process is the Constitution itself, because it specifically says what Congress can do. Another big influence, though, are individuals and interest groups. So individuals, which would be you or I, or interest groups would be groups of people, remember, coming together to achieve a common goal. There's interest groups that benefit education. There's interest groups that benefit, cattle ranching. Just anything you can think of has an interest group. And there's two sorts of ways they can influence, and that's either direct involvement, which means directly going to the Capitol, involving themselves with the process, talking to congresspersons, expressing their beliefs, or simulation. So, an important vocab term here, to lobby. So to lobby is to try to get government officials to support a group's goals. So lobby is basically just almost like trying to convince someone to do something. And lobbyists are the people that lobby. The people that go to the Capitol and say, hey, I represent this group, they have particular needs, what can you do to help us? And discussing why it's beneficial to help. Now, like it said, lobbyists try to influence legislators to introduce or vote for or against a bill. So introduce would be write a bill, present it to Congress, or to vote against or for. You see this political cartoon here, and I put it in here to kind of highlight the controversy of lobbyists. If it wasn't for lobbyists, it would be next to impossible to get our opinions presented to congresspersons. The reason is that there are about 350 million people in the United States, and we all have a lot of different interests. And it's very difficult to actually just go to Congress and talk to a congressperson. Now, from our perspective, it doesn't seem that difficult because we live so close. But back when I was living in Indiana, it would be a 12-hour drive to get to the Capitol. And from there, I would then have to have an appointment and all these other things. It would have been really difficult for me to get my needs addressed by a congressperson. If I have a lobby that represents my interests, in my case, education, then they can talk to congresspersons on my behalf. So in a way, lobbyists are very good because of that. Some people have said the lobbyists aren't good, though, and this is where the political cartoon comes in. Whoever wins, don't forget your promises to me. So lobbyists will give campaign donations to both candidates and then expect their vote for certain issues in return. And so lobbyists, some people say lobbyists are bad, some people say that they're good. It's not really necessarily good or bad, it's just what role do they play in our political process. So I don't really want you to go away thinking lobbyists are bad. I don't want you to go away thinking that they're, the best ever in the political process either. They're necessary based on our system, and I think that because of that, we could not operate without them. Ways individuals influence public policy. So we've talked about groups, let's talk about individuals. We can participate in politics by, and ... ellipsis, in other words, there's going to be a list, voting, or campaigning, or expressing opinions by. Okay, that's a different one. All right. So we can participate in politics by voting or campaigning. So I can vote for a candidate or I can be a candidate myself. Then we express our opinions by lobbying. So we join an interest group, that interest group lobbies on our behalf, or we're a lobbyist ourselves. We can also demonstrate. So I'm sure you've seen people demonstrating. They hold up signs. They say, hey, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. That's a really good way to get yourself seen if you've got a big group. If you're just one person, it looks kind of sad. Writing letters. You can write a letter to a congressperson, and this is more effective than you might think. We talked about it before when we said that people write letters because if they respond to my letter, I'm more likely to vote for them. So yeah, whenever I've written a letter to a congressperson, I've always gotten a letter back. It may have not been handwritten, but it's from the congressperson so that I know that they are listening to me. That way, when I go to vote, they hope that I will vote for them because they've listened to me, whether I agree with them or not. We can also join interest groups. So again, lobbying, joining interest groups. Interest groups affect public policy in a lot of ways. First is identifying issues. So, if an interest group is for, let's say the World Wildlife Foundation, right? That logo with the panda, WWF, and then they got sued by the wrestling company, and long story, look it up, it's fun. Anyway, they identified issues like pollution, or in the case, deforestation in China, which was resulting in a decreased population of pandas. They also make political contributions. So let's say I'm running for Congress, and I've got a record of really watching out for the environment. I might get a check in the mail from the World Wildlife Foundation, and they might be saying, hey, Mr. Kniesly, we got a bond, right? We know each other, we work together, and that is, for the best. We'll support you getting reelected because we know you'll help us out in the future. They also can lobby government officials. That's where someone's already in office, and they just call them and say, our supporters would really like it if you did this. It's kind of a way of saying, if you don't do this, we'll tell our supporters not to vote for you. And it's actually a really good way to have the government officials or congresspersons know what the people want. Because lobbyists are very educated on the issues. They know what they're talking about, and they can be very specific with congresspersons about what the maybe less informed members of their group want. And here's our last little slide. Individuals and interest groups influence public policy by identifying issues, so saying what the issues are, lobbying government officials, so that's calling those government officials, remember talking to them, like we said, and holding government officials accountable. And that's where there are supporters will not vote for you thing comes in, right? If a government official does something that an interest group or a lobbying group does not like, then they will be held accountable by maybe they don't get a campaign donation, or maybe they ask their supporters not to vote for them. This really affects congresspersons because the goal of congressperson is always to get re-elected. All right, so if you need to rewatch that, go ahead and rewind. We've reached our time limit. Hopefully that worked out. We'll talk about it after break, see how things went. Otherwise, enjoy your break, and I will see you all later.